All right, I am here. Manvir Singh, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, Manvir Singh.
Manvir Singh, who is the author of a new book called Shamanism, the Timeless Religion, which I very much enjoyed. I read some of it, I scanned some of it. I didn't have time to go in deep, but I have to say, I get a lot of these like promotional books from publishers, and uh, this one I'm going to go back and read it. I read the first few chapters and then I jumped ahead to sort of have a general sense. But it's really well written. I really enjoyed it enough. As I say, I'm going to go back and read it. I've read dozens of books on shamanism, but I feel like the way you wrote this one, it's also sort of a memoir, and it reminded me a little bit of a book called A Primate's Memoir by Robert
Robert
Sapolsky.
Sapolsky. Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. I haven't read that. I've read other Sapolsky, but not that one.
Well, it's really good because he alternates between his work with the baboons in Kenya, and then he'll tell a story about when he hitchhiked down to
Right.
Uganda just
Right,
for an
right, right.
adventure,
Yeah.
or some character who he met, a local guy who was helping out. So it's a really nice sort of blend of science and travel writing and memoir and coming of age story and all those different genres, which I think complement each other really nicely. And I think you did a really nice job with that as well. So
Thank you. Thank you.
congratulations.
I'm honored.
Yeah. Um, so you're a very ambitious guy, aren't you? Why the ambition? Is it I mean, you went to Harvard. You got your undergrad is evolutionary biology, is that right?
It's human biology, like, but I did ecology and evolutionary biology. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then anthropology.
And then human evolutionary biology. But it's funny because the Harvard anthropology department split into two departments. So it's essentially what was previously biological anthropology.
Right. And now shamanism.
Well, my PhD was actually the name of my dissertation is like the foundations of shamanism and witchcraft. So during my PhD, I went from coming in and wanting to be a primatologist to
Mm,
realizing that you can study shamanism in a rigorous way and within the discipline of human evolutionary biology and really pursued that.
right. Right. That's really interesting because I mean, I looked at your CV and kind of see, Harvard, and you write for the New Yorker, and, all this kind of like very impressive CV entries. But then shamanism is not the kind of thing you study if you're a very ambitious academic. It's kind of a fringe topic that might get a little, looked askance from the more serious people, the Richard Dawkins types in the world. So, did that, from your perspective, was that going against some flow in your character to go into shamanism, or did it all sort of, was it congruent in some way?
I think it was congruent. Yeah, I don't know if I had this like big plan or theory of my work. Honestly, what happened was, so for much of my life, I've been both an animal nerd and a mythology nerd, and then at the beginning of my PhD, realized that everything that I had learned about evolutionary theory and behavioral ecology and psychology, evolutionary psychology, I could apply not only to study animal minds, but to study humans. And of those things that humans do, I find most colorful and fascinating music, ritual, morality. And so I was really excited about applying that. And I had this thing early in my PhD. You come to a place like Harvard and you see all of these very fancy people and you see the currencies of prestige and success, papers, citations, etc. And I noticed in the beginning, and I really tussled with this, I like noticed myself becoming ambitious in a new way, and I noticed myself trying to chase these kinds of currencies, looking for like, oh, what's a paper, what's a topic that could get me a lot of attention, and I noticed myself interest-wise straying away from what really resonates, and so
Mm,
it was maybe a third into my PhD. I had already gone to I had spent quite a bit of time with the Mentawe. I had been becoming interested in shamanism, and I had worked on this project and it stalled and it failed, and I was like, "Man, I'm just gonna study shamanism. Like this is so incredibly cool. I would love
Mm.
to spend so much of my time reading about it." Um, and and I felt like I was becoming myself in a really familiar and kind of reassuring way. And ironically, that my work on shamanism has worked out. I mean, now I have a book, I have a job, and if anything, I think it was really a lesson for me that chasing these currencies of academic success are so not only shallow, but like they're so mercurial. And what's hip this year, will that be hip next year? And it's a lot of time just academics talking to themselves about their kind of like, oh, your study showed this. Well, my study, if you change this parameter, can show that. Becoming trapped in that is not necessarily useful, and sometimes it's really just like chasing what you find incredibly fun.
Well, that's awesome that you were able to do that. I mean, it's incredible that you're able to do that at all, but to do that at a place like Harvard, where I imagine the pressure to speak that language and trade in those currencies is extremely high. So it takes a lot of integrity and self confidence to do what you did. I really applaud that. That's awesome.
Thanks, thanks. I also I don't want to like overstate my own, courage, etc. I also had mentors who were incredibly supportive. So like there were two in particular. So my PhD advisor was Joe Henrik, who's this cultural evolution scholar, and he was really supportive of studying something like shamanism. Oh, this is widespread. This is worth examining. And so that was helpful. And then also a big mentor of mine has been this anthropologist Luke Lowacki, who has done incredible field work in East Africa on warfare among pastoralists. And he was very, very supportive of just like go do field work, learn about a place, and chase what you think is interesting, but also feels big. And I would say their support and the support of others, but those two individuals in particular um, gave me confidence.
Yeah, yeah. I almost met Joe Henrik once a long time ago. Probably was it like 20 is a year or two after Sex at Dawn came out. So it was like 2011, 2012. I was hired by a law firm in Vancouver, Canada. There
Mm.
was a court case they were doing about
Monogamy or something.
yeah, it was something with there was a cult
Yes,
that
right.
had group marriage or something, and they hired me to sort of write a treatise on the history of monogamy and some of the ways in which non-monogamy can actually be healthy. For it sounds like you know about this case.
Yeah, yeah, I know about it because I remember Joe was also called.
Well, that's the thing. He was called on the opposite
Yes,
side,
right, right. And
right?
then it became his whole work on how monogamy um, is in many cases good for societies. He has this big paper.
Right, which must have come out of the research sheet, or maybe he was already
No,
doing
I
the
think it did.
research.
I think the court case really motivated a lot of that
Okay.
research.
Right, right. So yeah, it was funny. So I wrote this thing and sent it to them, just sort of my perspective on monogamy and all that. And then they were like, okay, so we're going to fly you over for the, to testify and da da da. And I was like, testify? I never agreed to testify. I just wrote this thing on contract for you guys. And I was talking to my uncle, who is a big lawyer, who's argued before the Supreme Court and stuff. And I said, yeah, they're going to fly me up to Vancouver and this thing. And he was like, don't do that. Oh my God, they're just going to like pick you apart. They're going to like attack you personally. And blah blah blah. And then I looked, I don't know, some document showed Joe Henrik on the other side, and it's like, and I wrote to the lawyers, I was like, listen, you got Joe Henrik on one side and me on the other side. You don't want me to testify. I mean, this guy's super famous. I wrote a book. I went to a graduate school no one's ever heard of. Like, this is a bad idea. So I never met Joe, but we almost faced off
In the
in a
court of
very
law.
court of law where I would have been humiliated, I'm sure. Anyway, yeah. Speaking of great anthropologists at Harvard, Richard Evans Schultes. You ever read his work?
I've read a bunch of his papers. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
big Schultes fan.
he was awesome. Yeah, there's a beautiful book called One River
Yes,
about
I
his work.
I read One River while I was in Colombia, and I just met for the first time this weekend Wade Davis,
Oh, cool.
which
Yeah.
was an
Yeah.
awesome experience.
He's amazing. Yeah, I went to his place when I was living in Vancouver. I had him on the podcast and went to his I think it was his office. Um
At UBC.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He invited me to his house, but I don't think I ever got to his house. But uh it was it's really funny because I guess you've probably had this experience. He speaks the way he writes,
Yes,
like
yes, it was amazing.
complete
Yeah.
paragraphs.
Yes,
Yeah,
I was blown away. He gave this talk, which was only photographs, no text. And he would change them every couple seconds, and it was like a 40-minute talk. There was not a single or a stutter,
right.
maybe at 2 points, but it felt like he was just reading this literary prose. It was amazing.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
one of the best talks, if not, I don't want to say the best talk because I'm sure that I've seen better. There's one example, I saw a great talk by Paul Bloom once, but this was among the best talks that I've seen in the world. It was very inspiring. Actually, afterwards, I was like, I need to rethink how I give book talks.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I embarrassed myself because I set up the mics and blah blah blah, and I said something, I don't remember what, some introductory thing, and he started talking, and I got lost. I forgot where I was
Yeah.
because I was so struck by the way, and I said, "You talk the way you write," and he looked a little embarrassed, like, and I was like, "Holy shit! I didn't know anybody talked that way." That it like I think he took it as like I was making fun of him or something, and I wasn't. I was just like stunned. Holy cow, that's crazy. Yeah. So what's it like for him to write if he talks that way?
I mean, so
He's
I
like,
talked to him afterwards. I was like, that was amazing. How did you do that without any notes? And he was like, well, when I write, he said something like that. He was like, I talk the way that I write, but that's partly because when I write, I'm working through these ideas, and I feel like once I write something, I remember that.
ah,
And
yeah,
so yeah, he's like, I guess moving through this story, and he has these sentences that he's established, and he's drawing on them.
right.
But interacting with him over a couple of days, I saw how what appears in his lecture also appears in how he talks to people. So he kept talking about like religion as humans' response to death. That's like a theme that he likes to bring up. And then you also see that he pulls that into his talk. So there seems to be a way, I think this is common for so many of us, but really for him, I think these sentences and ideas move through so many of his different media, if you know what I
Right.
mean.
Yeah. His wife must be bored to tears. God, Wade, will you just talk like a normal person, please? So, I mean, Wade has this idea that religion is a response to death. You seem to see something similar or parallel in that shamanism is innate to the architecture of human consciousness. Is that a fair way of articulating it?
Yeah, or maybe an analogy would be like I think more that shamanism is a mirror of human nature, human psychology. So you can think about in the way that food, like a cookie, mirrors our physiological, you know,
Appetites?
appetites, yes, or our evolved preferences, or the whole suite of evolved predilections. I think shamanism similarly emerges to reflect our minds. So it's not like shamanism is a human impulse, but shamanism emerges to feed or reflect or tap into human impulses, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I've been writing about human impulses for a long
Yeah, right,
time.
indeed.
Evolved predilections, I think, is a phrase I've used a bunch. So, where do those evolved predilections come from, though?
Yeah, so some of them I think are just common to all of religion. So the predisposition to believe that invisible agents oversee uncertain outcomes. You confront death, illness, weather, disaster. Humans are very prone to think that someone was responsible. It could be the government or immigrants, but very often it's also gods, spirits, witches. Why we have that tendency, there's all kind of argument about like maybe we are hyperactive agency detectors. You've probably heard this term before. We have social minds, but as a byproduct or an incidental consequence of this, we are predisposed to just see agency in the world, especially agency behind misfortune. So that's one big psychological ingredient. Another is that we are a ritual species. We rely on these often relatively low cost interventions to try to influence high stake outcomes. I want to control the weather. I want to control, the uh, availability of game. I want to control harvests. And so we develop these magical practices to try to control these outcomes in the world. And then there are also similarly like evolutionary arguments for why we have those. But so these two predispositions, I think, are very important in religion more generally. There are arguments that like the core of religion is essentially turning to the supernatural for blessings and to avoid misfortune. And that's what you have at the center of these. And so then the question is, how do you go from this to shamanism? How do you go from this to visiting specialists, practitioners who are entering non-ordinary states and healing and divining? How do you go from this to people who are like claiming to cut open their bodies and have new skeletons? And so the central thing I think is that if because humans live in this kind of psychic world where these agents control misfortune, if I want to control misfortune, it's highly compelling if someone can plausibly engage with them. Oh, your illness is caused by a witch, I can fight off the witch. Oh, the rain goddess controls rain, I can talk to the rain goddess. But, if you came to me and you said these kinds of things, I would say, Chris, you're just like a regular guy. I can't do these things. Why should I trust it all that you can do these things? And this is where I think what's really central to shamanism is transformation, essential transformation, fundamental transformation, that this person becomes different from normal humans, but especially during the rituals, they are experiencing something else, they are doing something else, and that manifests as trance. And so I think there are these two really fundamental kinds of transformations involved in shamanic traditions worldwide. One is the initiation or the sense that this person deviates from normal humanness. So, death and rebirth ceremonies, long bouts of asceticism, in Mentawai, where I do field work, they have these ceremonies to transform their eyes. So there's this kind of fundamental transformation. But then there is also trance, altered states during the ceremony, where the shaman is behaving like you don't normally, but also experiencing something so fundamentally distinct in many cases that it makes much more plausible or tenable that they are interacting with these invisible agents.
So many of the phrases you use, you speak beautifully. You you're very careful to say that they appear to be in a transformational state, and they appear and they create the sensation of, and like phrases like that. Because I kept thinking like there's this level you're describing on which there's a sort of nearly universal human appetite to find some sort of agency in the control of weather and game and all these things, right? But then I'm imagining like a secondary layer where someone who's clever recognizes this appetite and says, there's added status available to me if I can exploit this appetite by seeming to enter into a transformational state, by seeming to be in contact with the dead or the spirits or other dimensions. Do you know who Stanley Krippner is? Have you ever heard that his name?
I've heard his name, but I can't remember. No, yeah.
He was sort of my mentor in graduate school, and he's published hundreds of papers on parapsychology. He's
Right, right. Yes, yes, yes.
kind of a old school OG parapsychologist.
Yeah.
And he and
Oh,
I were
right, for sure.
yeah, he and I were talking. He knows all, like he has the most incredible Rolodex you can imagine. Like it includes the amazing Randy and the amazing Kreskin, and like just under amazing, there are 5 or 6 entries. Uh,
Yeah.
but anyway, he's a really interesting person because he's sort of a bridge between the skeptics and the true believers. Uh I remember talking to him one time and saying, because he trained as a magician when he was a kid. He was an
Yeah.
amateur magician. And I said, so how often when you're studying psychic healer in the Philippines or in Brazil or something, how often do you see sleight of hand? And he said, oh, most of the time. um and his contention is that a lot of people who claim to have these powers, whether it be telepathy or healing, they do have some sort of um paranormal capacity, but they can't control it. So it happens sometimes. That attracts a lot of attention. And then, in order to not disappoint people, they learn trickery to sort of keep the ball rolling. So there is a lot of trickery mixed in, but he feels that there is often, in many cases, there is a core of something unexplainable that's actually happening. Would you see something like that in shamanism? Do you think, is there a trickster component to this?
Well, yeah, so I guess there are two questions here. One is, to what extent are they intentionally exploiting or intentionally engaging in trickery versus to what extent is there a feeling of sincere action? Another question is, to what extent are they providing the services that they are promising, healing, divination versus not? And then the final, so I guess there are three questions. And then the final is, can that be explained within materialism?
And also, all of those questions are equally applicable to psychotherapists.
For sure. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah, for
We
sure.
can circle back to
We can
that.
circle back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So for the first one, I think it's both. I think, I would totally agree with what you described from Stanley insofar as I think there's a lot of sleight of hand. I think they recognize the sleight of hand. But I think it's also the case, like I read in the book, that when shamans become sick, they often go to other shamans.
Mm.
When their children are sick, they often treat their children. And the thing about altered states, and you find this discourse in these communities a lot, there's a sense that some people are faking it, but I definitely think that many altered states that shamans are entering are profound. I mean, so like in the book, I've in Colombia, I've taken yopo with Colombian shamans, and that is an incredibly intense experience and very easy to interpret within a supernatural framework. It feels other, and I've had these experiences. I read about one in the book where I truly felt like I was engaging with ancient non-material beings. So for the first question, yeah, I would agree that there is some sleight of hand, but I do think in many cases there is sincere belief, and I think the same individuals can do both. For the second question, do they provide therapeutic outcomes? I think there's good reason to think that they do. I mean, I don't think shamanism is like monolithically good. I think it can be exploitative. I think it can seed distrust. I think it's a powerful technology more than being like monolithically good or bad. For the third question, can it be explained within materialism? So the book tries to really appreciate the experiential world, and I have a chapter on like, do I think that shamans are, or a part of a chapter? Do I think they, to in the words of a friend of mine, do I think they engage with nether spirits? Do I think they are talking to gods, etc.? And I draw on all of these attempts over the last century to demonstrate systematically that individuals have these powers, all of which have consistently failed. So I say that on the basis of all of these contests and competitions and these attempts at empirical demonstration, we cannot conclude that shamans are engaging with the spirits that they do. At the same time, I think we know very, very little about reality. Are we in a simulation? Whatever. Is this a cosmic octopus membrane? Who knows? I don't want to make any grand claim about the nature of existence. But I'm just saying on the basis of these contests, competitions, attempts at empirical demonstration, that I can't conclude that there is some kind of immaterial dynamic going on, if that's clear.
Yeah, although I read that section of the book and I'm familiar with the amazing Randy's um
And
offer.
Gavor, and
Yeah,
I mean, there
yeah.
have been a number of these contests and competitions.
But on the other hand, uh people have had open heart surgery with no anesthesia other than hypnosis. right? So the power of an altered state of consciousness to affect physiology is well demonstrated.
For sure.
Um,
And I mean, that comes to the second one where I think there are, um, I think it's perfectly plausible that these altered states or the experiences these altered states create for patients can be very therapeutic or have real effects. You know, the question is
right.
like, do you need to invoke gods, witches, spirits, etc.?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of an eternal question in medicine, right? Like the doctors walking around with a stethoscope around their neck who don't need it, and it's just there to elicit a certain
Yes, for sure. I mean,
emotional
I definitely think
response.
that's the case in medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's so complicated. My ex-wife, with whom I wrote Sex at Dawn, is a psychiatrist, born and raised in Mozambique, and she is, she'll say herself she's more of a shaman than she has an MD, but she's basically a shaman with an MD. You
Right.
talked about Glenn
Yeah.
Treisman
Yeah.
in
Glenn
the book.
Treisman, who also considers himself a shaman, this like
Yeah,
fancy psychiatrist at Hopkins.
right.
Um,
Exactly. I mean, there are natural healers, and the reason I made that sort of snide comment about psychotherapists is every time someone tries to quantify what psychotherapeutic technique is most effective with patients, they come to the same conclusion, which is they're all the same. What's different is the individual therapist. Some therapists
right.
elicit something in patients that leads to healing,
Right.
and some don't. And it doesn't matter where you studied or what technique you use or whatever. It's a very personal thing. I feel like something like that, that the rapport or the sort of human connection that you can have with someone feels shamanic to me. It feels primordial.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the common factors, research on psychotherapy, it does show that there are certain aspects of the relationship that predict a more therapeutic response. Like,
Right.
do you have a shared narrative for what's going on? Really importantly, is it an empathic relationship? So, yeah, there are a lot of contextual variables that we know predict a better therapeutic response. But I totally agree. Yeah,
Nice
like,
furniture. You have to have a comfortable chair. You know.
yeah,
Do,
yeah.
do you ever see
Um,
the Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David gets all upset with the therapist because the therapist chair is much more comfortable than his?
no, I haven't seen that.
It turns into a whole thing. Yeah, it's pretty great. Another thing you and I have in common is I've been to Sumatra. I was in Bukittinggi
Oh
years
no,
ago.
wait. Oh
Oh
my
yeah,
God. I've been to
yeah,
Bukit Tinggi, of course. That's like not
yeah.
too far from Padang. What were you doing in Bukit Tinggi?
Just just fucking
Just
around,
exploring.
man. Yeah, I traveled all through Southeast Asia for a couple of years. Like in the sort of late 80s, I guess it was, a few years after I got out of
Oh wow.
college. Yeah, I took a boat. I was in Singapore. I was in India, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, and then I was in Singapore, and I heard about that there was a boat you could get that went from Singapore to Bukittinggi. It like went up this river through Sumatra. And
Oh, what? So it comes
yeah, it's from Singapore, crosses the straits.
and then it goes through Sumatra all the way to Bukit Tinggi.
Right. It kind of bisects
Oh wow. Because Bukit Tinggi is
Sumatra.
like high in the mountains.
Yeah, maybe I got off somewhere else. I mean, I know I went to Bukittinggi,
Oh, interesting.
because that's sort of right on the equator, right?
It's very, very close. Yeah, and maybe Bukit Tinggi is on the equator. Yeah, but where I work in the Mentawai Islands is very close to the
Yeah.
equator.
And then I went up to Lake Toba.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, and there was an island in the middle of Lake Toba where I stayed for a while, and yeah, and then I went up to Medan, I think. Is that where
Yeah,
the
Medan.
there's an orangutan rehabilitation center up there? Yeah, it was a long time ago, but anyway, yeah, I remember Bukatinga. I climbed a volcano there. It was a disaster. Terrible, terrible idea. But
Mm.
I
I love
remember,
Sumatra.
yeah, Sumatra's wild. I mean, it was 80. I don't know what it's like now,
I'm
but
sure it's so different. I can't imagine what it was like in the late
it was
80s.
primitive, like yeah, some of the places I went, there was I'm not a super intrepid traveler. I'm not like Wade Davis or somebody. Uh, but that boat ride was crazy. I rode on the roof of the boat 3 or 4 days or whatever it was. And I remember it's the first time I'd ever seen fireflies that were synchronized,
Mm,
like the
mm.
whole tree flashes at
Oh,
once.
whoa.
Like I grew up in the East Coast. You grew up in New Jersey, right? So you probably
Yeah,
saw fireflies. They're all,
of course.
sporadic, and yeah, yeah, it was magical. Um, but you mentioned you were lecturing about primate testicles recently before I started recording. Let's get back to that. Why are you lecturing about primate testicles? That's my area, man.
I'm taking over. No, so I teach intro to biological anthropology or intro to human evolutionary biology. So
Okay,
in there we talk about sexual selection.
right.
Um, and yeah, and primate testicles are great both because they communicate the concept and like of course if you say testicle or penis, like the students suddenly pay so much more attention.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
And
You
then
have to.
there's that classic image of the chimpanzee brain and the chimpanzee testicle,
All right.
which
Yeah. You
is
should
compelling.
you should show the like adolescent male human brain and testicular storm going on. But I wanted to get back to this. One of the things you did in this book that I think is interesting and separates it from, the sort of literature on shamanism that people find the classic, Harners and the various people have written about shamanism over the years, is that you um, applied this shamanistic template to the modern world. Sort of talk about hedge fund managers claiming to have supernatural powers and the asceticism of, I work 80-hour weeks and all this kind of stuff. And, same thing with medical school, right? I mean, isn't that what they're doing? Like, oh, yeah, we go 3 days without sleeping. Like, that makes no sense. It's totally bad for your health. So how do you become a healer while you compromise your own health? It's bad for decision making, so it's
Yeah,
probably
that's an
not
interesting
to.
example. I didn't write about that, but you're right. You're right.
Yeah, I mean,
That
that's
is a
been a
weird
bugaboo for
institution to
me.
have.
It's very American too. Like I taught in medical school in Spain, and the Spanish medical education is very good, but it's not this whole like heroic journey thing that the American medical education is built around. Um, but anyway, you talk about and you describe shamanism as a technology, and so what I started thinking about is there shamanic potential in artificial intelligence?
Oh, interesting. Um, okay, yeah, yeah. Well, so two quick things. One is in the book, I'm very careful to say that like money managers are not technical shamans, but that they're analogous in a number of ways. Insofar as like,
They're
we
claiming the mantle in a way. I mean,
yeah,
I
I mean, it's a very similar role. I mean, insofar as it's like an uncontrollable system, and they are literally promising to divine it or forecast it, and then they engage in all of these kind of performances of extremeness and otherness, and
right.
and weird new forms of asceticism. So I think they're very similar. They don't enter altered states, and they don't invoke unseen realities, or at least unseen spirits and gods,
I
etc.
drink 15 triple espressos a day on Wall Street, right? Isn't that kind of like
Yeah, maybe
hyper?
I'm being too careful. Maybe I should look more at it. But the AI, so that's a fascinating question. And I think when you ask that, I think about like the logic of shamanism. And so at the center of the logic of shamanism is like there is, the world is chaotic, uncontrollable. We are convinced that there's an order in it, but we know that regular humans cannot interpret or engage with that order. So we go to these specialists who seem miraculous and seem more than human. And I guess what AI is that. It's a super intelligence. It's distinct from normal humans, and it has credibility um, by it being apparently super intelligent. And so I don't even think I think like whereas a shaman might have to have a death and rebirth ceremony or go through these bouts of asceticism or have trance to create the sense both for themselves and the community that they are doing something more than human. I think AI, just by dint of being like a digital algorithm, or however it's best described, um, that has access to arguably like all of written knowledge that has been recorded on the internet. I think it doesn't even have to engage in these other kinds of altered states. It itself is a transformative thing. And I even
Yeah.
notice how I engage with AI. I definitely give AI way too much predictive power than I should.
Mm.
Oh, like, my book came out this week. What should I expect for this and this and this? And like, it's probably hallucinating half of the things it's saying, but I think I give it more credence than I should. And so, yeah, that is a fascinating analogy that I didn't really think about.
I mean, to the extent that people become increasingly comfortable interacting with AI as some sort of discernible consciousness, it does have it does dwell in an inaccessible realm to
For
us,
sure, for
right?
sure,
It
for sure.
is
It
in
is a new
some other
kind of.
realm. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, I guess it exists in an inaccessible realm in two ways. One, it's like it's a realm of consciousness or state of being or decision making or whatever it is, computation that we've never otherwise engaged in. But yeah, for sure. Then there's also like the actual, behind the screen computational architecture, which is like totally inaccessible to our puny minds.
Yeah.
Um, but as a consequence, I think of both, we can give it more credence than it should sometimes have. We can, I think, I see this in my students, I see this in myself, that just as maybe some shamans might fib, but because of their credibility, their word might be taken more miraculous than it should be. I think we're probably very often doing the same with AI.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that part of the book really opened up, sort of blew my mind a little bit because I started thinking, okay, if hedge fund managers, claiming these rituals and sort of supernatural powers, and we've got the fastest computers in the world, so we can do this processing before the buy signal even reaches the market, and blah blah blah. Michael Lewis wrote about
Right.
that
Yeah, I remember that.
recently.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it made me think about all these people who claim some access to a realm that normal people don't have access to. And if that's shamanic, I mean, is Trump a shamanic figure? Right? Trump claims to have access to the truth in ways that no one else does. And people seem to believe him. A lot of people seem to think he does have some supernatural capacities.
For sure. I mean,
You
I think
know,
Trump is, again, I would be very careful to say he is a shaman. But I definitely think he's analogous in many ways. I mean, it's like people feel uncertainty and misfortune. He turns that into an agent, whatever, immigrants or the government, the deep state, etc. And then he presents himself as exceptional in precisely the way necessary to vanquish these
right?
agents. And that becomes a source of power for him, for sure. I mean, what I find very striking about modern Trumpism is that the enemy that is invoked is so similar, in fact, to the witches that you find across cultures. So during my PhD, I looked systematically at descriptions of witches across cultures, and you find that I found what I call a dimension that I call witchiness, and practitioners that are most witchy, or these narratives that are most witchy, are stories about people who not only cause illness and misfortune, through spells or the evil eye, um, but are also morally abhorrent. So they eat babies, or they have sex with family members, or they desecrate corpses. And then they are major existential threats. They often interact in leagues or cabals. They meet in these conspiracies in graveyards. And then you look at the depictions that are at the center of something like QAnon, and they are
Mm,
incredibly familiar. I mean,
right,
the cabal of pedophiles who
right.
control everything, um, and that then being the target of the messianic vanquisher is an incredibly familiar archetype. I mean, I think sometimes there's this enthusiasm or this eagerness to see modern Trumpism as just a product, or like as a in this kind of historically provincial or historically parochial way, that this is very much a reflection of the New Age interacting with male conspiratorial culture, when in fact it replays or resurrects archetypes that you have found in these moments of upheaval and uncertainty throughout time and across cultures. I mean, it looks like the narratives you find in the cargo cults. It looks like
Mm,
the depictions you found in the Taiping Rebellion. Yeah, so I
yeah.
definitely agree that there is an archetypal familiar structure here.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. And it's also sort of the snake eating its own tail in the sense that a lot of these people who were demonized by the Christian influencers were shamans. They were healers. They were female healers in many cases, using Amanita muscaria, and the whole thing about the witch's broom being a phallus for applying Amanita
Right. Yes, yes,
muscaria,
yes.
and all that.
I think that's a bit, yeah. I've seen pushback against like how well that.
Yeah, I've seen illustrations from like what is the 1400s or something of the woman with the broom, the phallus that they were using for that. And also it makes sense. I mean, the toads, the bufatina, that's not you can't take it orally, right? It'll kill you. Amanita also has a lot of toxins. Is not particularly good. But yeah, the Santa Claus stuff and the reindeer and the presents under the Christmas tree being the
Yeah, I mean,
Amanita.
yeah, there's definitely Amanita muscaria in northern Eurasia, including in parts of Scandinavia.
Right.
Whether like but to what extent is that a part of the witch trials? I mean, because I remember there was a paper that came out a year or two ago where they looked at, I think, all of the Scottish cases. I can pull it up, and they found far fewer herbalists or folk healers than I think they had expected. Which is just to say, I definitely think there's Amanita muscaria throughout
Yeah.
northern Eurasia. The extent to which it's a part of the Great European Witch Hunt, I'm not sure.
A lot of it was just women who didn't follow the rules in
Yeah, yeah,
terms
a
of
lot of it is,
sexual morality.
yeah, a lot of it is just women who are distrusted, or you just have some motivation to remove, or yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's pretty evil stuff. But looking at other, sort of thinking about other modern manifestations of this sort of energy, you mentioned Quakers at one point in the book. I thought that was an interesting, the whole sort of entering an altered state
yeah. I mean,
and,
the name refers to them quaking.
yeah, and
Yeah,
Shakers.
yes.
But another one I thought of was Steve Jobs,
Mm.
how he has this sort of cult um status, and he also talked about psychedelics being very important in his development and his education. Yeah, and the whole Silicon Valley
And his diet.
psychedelic
I
and
mean,
his
he
diet.
was a
Yeah,
frugivore. I mean,
right.
so I think you find this in tech CEO culture quite a bit, where there are these narratives or these stories or presentations of them being, they have sometimes these absurd diets. I ate a different food every day, or Elizabeth Holmes claimed to subsist
Mm,
only on green juice, which is like probably just biologically impossible.
right,
And then
right.
you look at the coverage of her. Oh, she speaks in a ghostly whisper. She read Moby Dick by the age of 9. She's taking like college level Chinese in high school. Um, I think because I think like success in these tech companies is also an incredibly uncertain system. Some of them are
Mm,
going to be worth $1 billion or $10 billion. Others will not make anything. And so when you have a highly uncertain system, it again incentivizes these performances of otherness to convince other people that you have the miraculous power.
right, right. Yeah, that's so interesting. And so I thought that was a really important thing that you did in this book that was very valuable, is pulling that what you just articulated there, the performance of otherness in the context of highly uncertain, high risk
Yeah.
environments, which, yeah, it goes into military planning. It goes into, I interviewed a guy named Bruce Damer on the podcast years ago. Really interesting dude. He was on one of the committees to choose the landing site for the Mars mission.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he's a consultant at NASA. He was an early he did work with designing spacecraft and all this kind of stuff, but he like went and got his PhD years in his 40s. I think he was already like deep into consulting at NASA and doing all this astrophysicist work. Um, and I was like, well, wait, you got your PhD like after you're already doing the work. How did you know this stuff? And he's like 6'8". I'm interviewing him at his house up in the mountains above Santa Cruz in the redwoods, and it was a rainy, dark night in this big dark house, and he's wearing this like long trench coat, and he's got uh, a beard. What's that called? The like a
Goatee? No.
like the Merlin the magician beard.
Right. Yes, yes, yes.
I forget what that's called. Anyway, he looks like this sort of wizard,
Mm,
and he's a wonderful guy. Really, I got to know him better later. And anyway, he said, well, he said, I have access to the realm of all knowledge. I said, well, what do you mean? How do you do that? And he said, well, I just enter a state of consciousness where I have access to knowledge, whatever I need. And I said, well, how do you learn to do that? And he said, I learned in the womb. And the story he told, this incredibly moving story, he said, I remember being in the womb and I heard voices, animated voices. And then I felt my mother withdraw her love from me. And I reached out to try to find this source of love that was gone. And I never found it, but I found this realm of universal knowledge. And he said, years later, I understood that was the moment my mother decided to put me up for adoption. And that was his story. He never found his mother's love, but he found this realm where he could just go to this realm and know how to design a spacecraft or
mm.
where on Mars would be the best place to land. You know, he's to me, a very shamanic figure in a very modern shamanic figure in that he's using shamanic techniques to access information that's necessary for cutting edge technology. Very very interesting. You should if you ever wanted to write a profile of him or something, I'd put you in touch. He'd be an interesting New Yorker profile.
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
got
give me his name.
he's got in his house, he's got like the first mainframe computers. He's got like
Well,
a private museum of early computing technologies. Fascinating, really interesting guy.
wait, so why did he get a PhD?
I don't know. I don't remember what the story was. It's in the archives if you want to listen to my conversation with him. His name's Bruce Damer,
Mm.
Damer, and he got it in like Ireland or something, or Scotland, maybe Edinburgh or somewhere like that, in astrophysics, I believe. But yeah, he was already doing the work. Maybe he needed it, like NASA was like, you got to get the PhD to be on this project or something. I don't remember. Yeah, really interesting guy. So other modern manifestations I was thinking about, like hypnosis. Um, there's I feel like what we're circling around here is this idea that there's something that's both real and unreal, and the performative, what did you say, the how did you say it, the sort of performance of otherness, the
Mm.
in order to harness this energy that's already in the room, because people want to believe there's someone who has access to this knowledge that's so important to them, whether it's to make a fortune or to avoid the next earthquake or whatever.
And
Mesmer,
I think performance is always a tricky word because it's like, is a money manager performing, or do they sincerely think that not sleeping and doing these crazy things will give them power? Is a shaman performing? I think like the thing about, so I think like the social dynamics and the cultural evolution lead to these practitioners who, in many cases, really sincerely believe, but their actions nevertheless have this kind of signaling performative value, where even their experiences have a performative value, where they're about like building credibility for themselves and especially for their clients, if you know what I
but
mean.
can it go the other way as well? In other words, can you fake it and then make it, and then you're like, oh, maybe this isn't fake after all, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I included the full, yeah, I don't know if I included this part of the story in the book, but there was this really interesting biography of a Kwakwaka'wakw shaman named, I think it's pronounced something like Kesalid. And there's a lot of debate about who Kesalid is, or It probably was Franz Boas's assistant, and this person had lived with Westerners for a long time. But nevertheless, while he was growing up, he became a shaman, he says. Franz Boas, this famous anthropologist, writes down his life story. And he says that in the beginning, he was very skeptical that shamans had the powers that they claimed. And so he wanted to become a shaman to learn whether they had these powers. This is in the Pacific Northwest. So an indigenous person in the Pacific Northwest. And he very early learns that there's a lot of sleight of hand. There's one technique he describes where if you're sucking on someone's illness, you put some down in your mouth and then you bite down and you get it all bloody. And so you suck and then you say, "Here's the illness," and you pulled out this bloody down. And he says he did this. He learned it from one shaman teacher, and then he moved to another area. He started doing it. Everyone was blown away. All of these clients were going to him. Other shamans were coming to his house, and they were like, "How are you doing this? What is your technique?" I think one shaman was like, even offered his virgin daughter to have sex with Caselli to learn the technique. And so Caselli talks about this being a moment of disenchantment with the institution. Oh, these people are faking it. But then over the course of his career, he comes to suspect or comes to believe that in fact there is a part of his technique that works.
Mhm.
That he is a source of therapy. And that I think is a part of probably a lot of shamans' experiences where there's a recognition that there is some sleight of hand here. And I mean, just as their clients are sufficiently convinced that they keep going back to them. And like I lay out in the book, I think there are good reasons to think that in many cases shamans do provide therapeutic outcomes. Um, and so the same reasons that have their clients continuing to come to them, I think also lead them to think that they work. And so I do think there is a dynamic where you can fake it until you seem to make it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that you see that in I was watching an interview with someone last night. I forget who it was who became very famous, a performer, a comedian or something. And they were talking about how there's this sort of uh energy when you become famous, then you look back and say, they were all wrong. I was right the whole time. Like
Mm.
I would like that all led to this, therefore that made sense, even though at the time you were doing it, you had no idea it was going to work. There's a sort of a retrospective justification that happens. And I feel like our culture is set up that way to reinforce this, right? With the narrative of, everyone saying, well, how did you get to do what you're doing? And then, oh, let me tell you,
Oh
like,
yeah, right. Everything I did led to this moment.
yeah,
Yeah,
and you
right.
you know you nodded toward it earlier when you were talking about your studies, and you said, "Well, I didn't really have any big plan. It just sort of happened this way." But that's not how narrative works.
Right, for sure.
Narrative,
It's narrativized. It can be
yeah,
narrativized in a million different ways. And it's also complicated because it's like, day to day, hour to hour, people have so many thoughts. It's like, okay, I didn't have a plan, but I did also have a plan on that day. And, you're constantly reconsidering. But it's definitely the case for sure that after someone makes it, there is this retrospective rewriting of the story and of recontextualizing everything for that moment.
yeah. Did you happen to see an HBO documentary came out recently called "Love Has Won"?
No.
So it's about this woman who was a manager at a McDonald's or something in Phoenix, and she took some MDMA one night. She had never done drugs, or not MDMA. She had an alcohol problem. Anyway, the MDMA convinced her she was God,
Mm.
and
Even afterwards, or just while she was on
it
MDMA.
continued. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
something that clicked. At least this is the narrative, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and she moved here to Crestone and bought a
No
little
way.
rented a little cabin somewhere, or a trailer or something, and started doing this stuff online. And people, she attracted followers, and all these sort of lost young souls came and were sending money. And she claimed all these powers of healing, and if you send this money, I'll send you this colloidal silver, was their main thing that they sold. And she was drinking all this colloidal silver to the point where her skin started to turn blue. And then it's a really good documentary because they did all this stuff online and they recorded everything and they gave it all to the filmmaker. So she has all this really, intimate first person material. And so then the woman who claims she was getting transmissions from what she calls the galactics, which are which is there's a chart on the refrigerator of the galactics, which included Stalin and Hitler and Cleopatra and Robin Williams. He was the main galactic. So they all talked to Robin Williams and Robin Williams transmitted it to her. It's like Looney Tunes, right? But thousands of people are sending her money. And then there's this really uh, heartbreaking moment late, kind of late. I think it's a 3 or 4 part series where she's very sick, probably liver failure because she's drinking vodka by the bottle the whole time. And she says, I'm really sick. I think I need to go to a hospital. And her followers say, oh, you don't mean that. You don't want to go to some 3D hospital. They don't understand what's really happening here. And and that moment, she transforms from being this like in charge, self-proclaimed God with all these followers to a human sacrifice. She becomes the sacrifice because they won't, the narrative is more important than her. And so she dies. They basically kill her by refusing to get her medical care because even though she no longer, she's willing to sacrifice the narrative to go to a real doctor,
Yeah.
they're not. It's a crazy thing. And really interesting just to see that sort of transformation of like, you're the you're you're
Yes.
you're
Right.
Elvis, right? You're like everyone worships you, but you end up getting sacrificed. Or
Yes.
Michael
Right. Right. Right.
Jackson.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Right. Um, in the book, I write about this person, Alice Amma, this Ugandan prophet, and I wrote about her for a piece recently in the New Yorker. But her story, something that I found really fascinating about her story, which is kind of relevant over here, she, would become possessed by these spirits, and she became a prophet who tried to overthrow the Ugandan government. She created this huge crusade, pan-ethnic crusade. It starts with one ethnic group and then it comes to encompass all of them. And she would promise things like bulletproof magic, so you can go into battle and you won't get shot. And then ever so, people, they would lose battles sometimes and people would get shot and they would come back. And it, it felt like a very similar thing where she was being sacrificed for the narrative. And what she would say, or the spirits would become, she would become possessed by the spirits and then they would blame her. They would say, Alice has not been following our instructions. Alice needs to be beaten and punished. Um,
wow.
and so it was a similar thing where I think for her, the narrative was also actually related to to her legitimacy and continued power, but that sometimes meant actually sacrificing her to keep the spirit alive, if you know what I
Right,
mean.
right. Yeah, like a masochistic messiah. That's a really interesting
Yeah.
concept.
Well,
Yeah,
it's like she was turning the spirits who possessed her into the Messiah so that she can become her own scapegoat.
right, right. Oh my God, that's yeah, very strange stuff, dude. I could talk to you forever. I want to respect your time though. That what I want people to take away from this is that you're a really interesting guy and this is a really interesting book. Our conversation isn't really a reflection of the book. So, and I wouldn't even try to do that. But what do you think? One last question where, because I feel like all this stuff about is it real? Is it tricksterism? To what extent does that framing even make sense? It keeps leading me back to Carlos Castaneda.
Interesting.
Yeah. Do you have any, have you read his work or do you have
I've
any?
read the first book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how you're evaluating it. Are you evaluating it as like an anthropological text? Then it's
Right.
pretty trickstery and authentic. Are you evaluating it as like a cultural object that created a lot of excitement and that
Well,
spoke to people, then it's like doing a different thing.
yeah, I mean, to me, it's so meta, right? Because it's probably he was the person who introduced shamanism into modern American consciousness more than anyone else, and yet
Oh,
he
interesting.
and he himself was this very enigmatic
Yes, right. I mean,
figure.
that tends to be a really interesting thing about these figures who write a lot about shamanism. Like Eliade was similarly,
Oh yeah,
he made shamanism famous, but was also a really peculiar dude,
yeah.
and had this whole self mythology about himself, and wrote presumably tens of books by the age of whatever, 20 or 30, was having love affairs with Maitreyi Devi, would himself have his whole ascetic routine. Yeah, and Carlos Castaneda was, of course, his own kind of shamanic, charismatic, mysterious figure. Um, yeah, but yeah,
And
yeah.
we haven't even talked about music. And you said earlier, and I think you talk about this in the book as well, that you sort of make a parallel between music and shamanism, and that they both sort of are universal. Everywhere there's human consciousness, they both emerge, and there are similarities, and um, and I feel like the whole sort of rock and roll, like what's Jimi Hendrix doing if not accessing an
Mm.
alternate reality and bringing it back to us in some way, like these transcendent musical figures, and also the way they dress and the way they move and the sort of sexual prowess and all this kind of eroticism, and like there's so many. It does feel like, getting back to your central thesis, it does feel that there is this sort of shamanic potential or capacity that just keeps manifesting in culturally appropriate ways and at the right moment, at the right you
I
know
mean, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's like the reason that shamanism has emerged in so many societies so often is that it speaks to us. Like
yeah,
we find incredibly attractive and powerful the promises and the image of the shaman. So of course, similar elements, similar practices, similar aspects of identity building will manifest in all of these places because they are so potent. And so that's why I really think of it as like a cognitive technology. I mean, I really my whole shtick is that I think about it as having a powerful, very powerful effect on the mind and pulling us in these directions. Um, yeah, but and I would say that the link between music and shamanism, I think there are two big ones. One of them is that both of them are these like near universal, I mean, music even more so, arguably universal behavior that pops up everywhere. They exhibit interesting patterns. They reflect aspects of human nature. But then, of course, in so many societies, music and shamanism are deeply linked. Like the shaman enters altered states very often through music, even if there are hallucinogenic drugs. There's often music, and then separately, shamans are very often dancing and drumming. So I think the power of shamanism has long been one that has piggybacked on the power of music.
yeah. There's a fantastic essay I often return to called "Hear That Long Snake Moan" by Michael Ventura.
I love that line.
Yeah, it's refers to voodoo,
Oh, word.
and he traces the development of rock and roll and jazz back
Mm,
to New Orleans, into the West Indies, back to West
back to West
Africa.
Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And also Ireland, and the whole sort of Irish slave trade briefly in Jamaica and the West Indies, which is why, Bob Marley has this weird, very not Spanish accent, right? This brogue kind of accent in Jamaica relates back to the Irish
Mm.
under Cromwell, I think, who was selling the Irish women and children into the slave markets. But yeah, it's an amazing essay because it's all about this sort of voodoo tradition, like Jelly Roll Morton, who was one of the first jazz musicians, was raised by a voodoo priestess,
Mm,
and there's
mm.
it's a very intertwined kind of this magical consciousness in the early advent of jazz.
Oh,
And
that sounds amazing. That sounds
yeah,
very cool.
yeah, I'll send you a copy. I have a PDF saved because it's very It's pretty hard to find, so I distribute it now. But yeah, it's a fantastic. I mean, all this crazy stuff like, um, uh, well, rock and roll meant to have sex. That's what rock and roll means. So these early songs, we're going to rock around the clock tonight. We're going to rock all night. You know, that meant we're going to fuck all night. And the white DJs were playing the songs not knowing what they were saying. So it's this really interesting way of kind of getting past the censors, you know?
Yeah, I mean, even now, you like it's like an oldies station. I mean, I was driving around with my parents when I was like 5, listening to Rockin' Round All Night.
Yeah, I'm going to rock you all night long.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
sure you are. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, listen, Manvir Singh, thank you for your time. I'll let you get on to your other stuff.
Thanks, Chris. It was so much fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I'm going to stop recording now.